These older FromSoft games have really surprised me. If you've been around the channel, then you know I covered the first Shadow Tower a little over a month ago. That was the first time I had played one of these older Fromsoftware RPGs since I was a kid. And I came away from it a lot more interested than I was expecting. There's something about these games that are really sticking with me. They feel lonely and weird and just oddly comfortable at the same time. There's always this kind of constant tension in the background where the game barely explains anything. All the systems feel really rough, and every bit of progress feels like you actually worked for it. After that first Shadow Tower video, a lot of you brought up Abyss in the comments, and I get why. The original game was already unique, but Abyss takes that foundation and pushes it into a pretty wild direction. It's still a first-person dungeon RPG, but it starts to feel very different from the first game pretty much immediately. So what makes Abyss stand out so much? Why did it never officially leave Japan? And why do the people who know this game talk about it like it's one of FromSoftware's greatest hidden gems? What was Shadow Tower Abyss? So before we really get into Abyss itself, I think it helps to place it for a second. Now I'm not going to spend too much time going back through Kingsfield or the first Shadow Tower, since I already covered that in the original game. But by this point, FromSoftware had already made several games in this style. They'd been making these first-person dungeon RPGs for a while by this point. The movement was slow, levels were usually dark, and the people you met along the way felt off in ways that were kind of hard to explain. Combat was rough, there was very little guidance, and the worlds themselves seemed built to be learned through trial and error, rather than just clearly explained. That was already part of their identity before most people knew them for Dark Souls. Shadow Tower came out of that same lineage, and it felt like FromSoftware were pushing that formula into something rougher. It still had the bones of those earlier dungeon RPGs, but everything felt tightened and a bit harsher, pushing you to hold together under constant pressure. It had that same quiet, lonely atmosphere, but it leaned into it harder, making the whole experience feel more fragile and more survival-focused than a lot of the games around it. Abyss is interesting because it comes back to that same branch a few years later, during a very different moment for FromSoftware. By the early 2000s, FromSoftware had already moved into the PS2 era, putting out Eternal Ring as one of their early PS2 RPGs while also keeping their mech series going with Armored Core 2. Around this time, they were kind of all over the place creatively, trying out a bunch of different ideas at once. They still had these weird first-person RPG instincts, they were still making mech games. And they were experimenting a lot with darker action games, horror games, and weird fantasy ideas like Echo Knight, Kuon, and Evergrace. And quick side note, I do have a video on Kuon if you're interested in learning more about that one. It became one of the most expensive games to get physically on PS2. But anyways, Abyss feels like part of that specific era of FromSoftware where the studio was still throwing different ideas at the wall and seeing what shape they could take on better hardware. And that matters because Abyss really does feel like a sequel that knows what it's trying to do. The first Shadow Tower was already a hard, dark, and lonely game. Abyss builds on that foundation but pushes it in a more active direction. It keeps the harsh difficulty and oppressive world while introducing a new control style and more modern weapons. You still get that old FromSoftware dungeon RPG feel, but now you're moving through it with guns, smoother controls, and combat that's a lot easier to understand. The structure also feels a bit more guided than the first game. That's probably the first big thing to understand. Abyss isn't abandoning what Shadow Tower was. It's revisiting that idea on PS2, but instead of simply refining it, it pulls it in a different direction, making things feel a bit quicker, a bit easier to follow, while still holding on to that weird, unsettling vibe. Another thing kind of hanging over Abyss is that it never officially left Japan. That's a big part of why the game has the reputation it does now. And from what Age-Tech producer Mark Johnson said at the time, most of the localization work was already finished, aside from some things like the packaging and the manuals. Then the Western release was cancelled before it had a chance to reach anyone. We'll come back to the release situation later when we talk about reception and legacy, because that part deserves its own part. But for the context here, it means Abyss was cut from a lot of the audience that may have been curious about it. That's why the game feels buried in a way that's different from a lot of obscure FromSoftware games. Some games are obscure because people saw them and moved on. Abyss became obscure because most Western players never got the normal chance to see what FromSoftware had made here. and that gives the game this strange place in the studio's history. It's a sequel to one of their harshest old RPGs, made during a time when Fromsoftware was still experimenting across genres and hardware. It takes that Shadow Tower formula and pushes it into something a bit more active, more weapon-driven. And then, just as it's finding its footing, it disappears from the official Western lineup, before the audience ever really has a chance to form around it. So before we talk about the tower, the weapons, the shops, the statuses, or the way the game actually moves, all this stuff is important to understand. Abyss is one of those FromSoftware games that feels like it was made in the gap between eras. It carries the old dungeon RPG instincts forward, tests them on PlayStation 2, and ends up as one of the strangest branches in the company's history. One of the biggest changes with Abyss is the actual shape of the game. The first Shadow Tower was built around going down. The whole game felt like a descent. Every layer made the world feel a bit further away, and the deeper you went, the more it started to feel like the tower was turning into something less human. Abyss flips that movement around. This time, we're climbing. And that one change does a lot for the pacing, because the whole game starts to feel more like an expedition through the tower. We're still dealing with the old FromSoftware pressure, still moving through weird areas, managing resources, fighting enemies, reading the environment, and trying to stay alive, but the structure around all that is a lot easier to understand. Most floors feel like they're built around a small chain of connected worlds. You step out of the elevator, take a second to get your bearings, and the game usually nudges you towards the starting direction. From there, you just kind of move through one area, then into the next, until you eventually reach the section that has the elevator key. And the elevator keys are the most important part here. It's the main goal, but it also kind of tells you how you're doing. When you're new to the game, you don't always know how many areas are attached to the floor you're on. You may move from one world into another and still wonder how much of that layer is left. But once you find the key, the shape of the floor starts to make sense. The key tells you, okay, we're at the end of this chain now. We're probably heading back to the elevator. That makes the loop back feel a bit satisfying. It gives the floor a clean ending without the game having to stop and explain it. You find the key, the path starts bending back towards the tower spine, and the next climb opens up. That's one of the reasons Abyss feels more directed than the first game to me. It still expects you to pay attention, it still lets you get turned around. The game has maps and markers on the walls, and once I learned how to read them, they could help a little, but I never felt like I was depending on them constantly. The readability comes from the structure itself. You understand the floor by moving through it. You start to recognize that rhythm: elevator, world, next world, key, loop back, higher floor. And the important part is that Abyss does this without making the areas feel flat. That's where I think the game improves a lot from the first game. The original game did have different worlds, and some of the later areas definitely stood out, but a lot of the earlier sections lived in that same general mood, that kind of oppressive dungeon feeling. Abyss does a much better job at making each area feel really different. You move through forests, caverns, poison areas, these insect nests, illusion worlds, places focused on water or deserts, open mountains. These areas feel more like distinct places inside the tower instead of simple variations of the same dungeon. That helps the climb feel bigger. Every floor feels like it's pulling us into different pockets of the tower. The elevator gives the game a central spine, but the worlds branching off from it each have their own atmosphere, their own little problems to solve. And I think this is where Abyss gets really interesting. The game's more directed because the floors have a clearer route, but the individual worlds also give you smaller objectives that make the level design easier to understand. The game will usually give you a hint, an environmental rule or a visible change, and then it lets you figure out the rest. The insect area is a pretty good example. You meet an NPC who tells you there's a large enemy ahead, and that light is protecting it, and that tells you enough. The game gives you the situation, points you towards the problem, and then leaves the room for you to connect the idea yourself. So now the path forward has a purpose. You're moving through the area looking for the magic light. You're trying to understand how to remove that protection and open up the way ahead. The area has enemies and danger, but it also has a clear reason for why you're pushing forward. That kind of objective makes the level feel more deliberate. The poison area does something similar, but in a different way. The whole world is poisoned, and you start seeing these fountains that can purify the area. But the fountains need stones. There's a little bit of text pointing you in that direction, but the game never turns it into a clear set of instructions. You just start putting the pieces together. The world is poisoned, the fountains are here for a reason, the stones have to go somewhere. And once that clicks, exploration gains a purpose. You're still searching through the dangerous area, but now you're keeping an eye out for these stones, knowing you need them and understanding what they might do for the area around you. That's the kind of direction I really like in these older games. The game doesn't need to pause everything and say, here's your objective. It lets the environment and the objects explain the goal. You still get that satisfaction of figuring it out yourself, but you're rarely just wandering without any idea of what the area wants from you. The Illusion world may be my favorite example of this. That whole area feels like Abyss at its best because it's just using the world, the objects, and simple cause and effect to show how to move forward. You find these pedestals connected to portals, and at first they just feel like another strange piece of the level, but then you start realizing that placing items into these pedestals activate the portals. The portals are connected, and the area starts becoming this little routing puzzle where you have to open the right paths in the right order. Again, the game doesn't over-explain that. It gives you the pieces, and then it trusts you to understand how to put them together. And once you do, the area becomes really satisfying to move through. You clear rooms while learning the logic of the world, and then that level adds another layer with these doors and these wraith-like torch statues. You find this door with these statue torches on it, and at first it's just another weird object in the environment. Then you move deeper into the area, you fight a knight, and notice that one of the torches lights up. I just think it's a cool kind of design. There's nothing telling you to defeat 4 more knights to open the door. You see one torch light up after one knight goes down, and if you're paying attention to that, it kind of clicks what the game wants from you. Now the area has direction. You know what the door's asking for. You know these knights matter. You know the world is built around finding them, fighting them, and watching the door slowly respond to what you're doing. That's where Abyss feels more confident to me. It gives you more structure than the first game, but it still lets you figure things out just by paying attention. You're being guided, but the game usually hides that guidance inside the world itself. That just makes the whole climb feel active. You're finding the next door while also solving the floor. You're reading what each world wants, finding the object or enemy or route that matters, and then folding that progress back into the tower's main elevator path. And I think that whole rhythm helps the pacing a lot. Abyss can still get tense and a little awkward. It'll still make you stop and wonder if you've got enough supplies to keep going. But since the route is easier to follow, it feels like you're actually making steady progress. You're pushing forward floor by floor, and the tower keeps reshaping itself around that climb. Each new layer opens into another pocket of the tower with its own rules, problems, and its own way of slowing you down. Finding the key marks your progress and shows that you understand what the section was asking of you. And when you finally make your way back to the elevator, it doesn't feel like you're just checking off another step. It feels like you're surviving another stretch of the tower's climb. And that's the big difference in how Abyss flows. The first Shadow Tower felt like you were just sinking deeper into a nightmare the whole time. Abyss feels more like you're climbing through something that keeps checking if you actually understand how it works. And for me, that's why this sequel is easier to follow without losing that old Fromsoftware vibe. The game is still weird, it still expects patience, asks you to pay attention instead of just following a marker, but it's a lot easier to follow now. Get wrecked. Hey, just real quick, if you made it this far into the video, thank you for hanging out with me for a bit. If you're enjoying it, consider subbing. There is a lot of content like this already on the channel, and there's always more coming. If you want to help the video grow, leave it a like and drop a comment. Let me know if you've ever heard of Abyss or had a chance to play it as a kid, or just what you think about these old Fromsoftware games. I love reading your all's comments. Also, share it to a friend that you think might be interested in the video. Those shares go a long way. But alright, that's enough of all that. Let's get into the combat, because it's a bit different than the first game. Combat is where Abyss starts feeling like a much bigger step away from the first game. The original Shadow Tower was mostly built around a melee swing and magic. It worked for what the game was doing, but it was also very stiff. You had to be right up on enemies to hit them. And a lot of the tension came from how uncomfortable that made every close-range fight feel. Abyss still has some of that old first-person awkwardness, but combat feels a lot better here. The biggest reason is that we have more ways to answer what the game puts in front of us. You have melee weapons, guns, magic, directional attacks, different weapon speeds, different ranges, and then the familiar Shadow Tower systems laid on top of that, like stamina management and gear that wears down as you use it. So even though the combat still feels old, it gives you more to work with. Get him with that backswing. That makes it awkward but satisfying, and I think that's the right way to describe it. This is not smooth in a modern action game kind of way. There's still a weird stiffness to it. You still have to learn the timing, have to be careful with spacing, but once you start understanding how the weapons work, it becomes much easier to settle into the rhythm of fighting. Abyss puts a lot of its identity into the arsenal. The game has over 500 different weapons, and you start to notice that pretty fast. The game is constantly giving you new stuff to try. Swords, axes, polearms, pistols, shotguns, AKs, grenade launchers. Just equipment that feels like it came from a completely different kind of game. That's where the tone starts bleeding into the combat. Because this is still a first-person dark fantasy dungeon RPG. You're moving through what feels like a fantasy world, and then the game starts handing you pistols and rifles, gas masks, bulletproof vests, and flight gloves. It just adds to the overall weird vibe of the game, gives it a very specific tone. It kind of feels like a desperate expedition, like someone dragged modern gear into an ancient world, and still just barely made it through. That mix is a huge part of why Abyss stands out. The weapons go beyond being stronger tools, they change the way the world feels when you're playing through it. They stun locked me. Good lord. Most of the time, I had a gun in one hand and a one-handed melee weapon in the other. That just kind of became my go-to setup for most of the game. A melee weapon handled anything up close, and the gun was there for stuff that was flying, more annoying enemies, or when I just needed to feel safer to deal with something from a distance. But I do think it's important to explain how the hand system actually feels. You can equip a weapon to each hand, so you can have a gun and a melee weapon. 2 melee weapons, 2 guns. Then you also have larger weapons that take both hands, like heavier melee weapons or just bigger guns. You're not really using them both at the same time in some flashy action game way. It feels more like you're just swapping between whatever you have ready. And that actually works really well here, because Abyss is always throwing something at you that you have to react to. Most of the time, I just went with whatever was strongest. Whatever was about to break, how much ammo I had left, and what felt good at the moment. I wasn't really looking at enemies and thinking, alright, this exact sword is the perfect answer. Most of the time, I was just using whatever was strongest at the moment until it started getting close to breaking. Then I'd swap to something else. And that rotation matters because weapons in Abyss still feel temporary. Melee weapons break pretty often, especially early on, so you're always kind of thinking about it. Armor didn't feel like it was falling apart nearly as much as it did in the first game, but melee weapons still had that same fragile, don't get too attached kind of feeling. And that adds tension to the fights. It doesn't ruin every fight, but it's always in the back of your mind. You might find a weapon you like, get used to how it feels, and start getting comfortable with it. Then the durability drops and you have to decide if you want to keep using it or switch before it breaks. Sometimes this happens in the middle of a fight. That's where Abyss keeps that old survival feeling inside a combat system that's a lot more flexible. You have more tools now, but those tools are still wearing down. Guns are the biggest change in how combat feels. They're useful enough that I found myself relying on them pretty often. Flying enemies are the easiest example. If something's in the air, a gun just feels like the obvious choice. There are even areas where the game kind of nudges you toward using range, like the Harpy section, where I basically stuck with a rifle for most of it since everything was flying around. At that point, the level itself is telling you what kind of tool to keep ready. But guns are also useful outside of those obvious moments. Sometimes I would pull one out just to clear a room a little easier, and most of the bosses are a lot easier with a gun. So ammo becomes something you think about beyond the fight you're currently in. I think this is what keeps guns from flattening the game. They give you comfort, but they also cost something. Every shot kind of makes you pause for a second. Do I really want to use this here? Is this enemy worth it? Am I just making this room easier now and screwing myself over for a boss later? That kind of thinking just really works well here. The game gives you guns, but it still makes them part of the resource economy. So firearms make the game feel more active and more aggressive, while ammo keeps them from becoming a free solution. Yeah, I think this level is really cool, but it's super short. We're almost at the end of it already. Melee has its own rhythm too, and it's honestly pretty easy to get into once you mess around with it for a bit. Every weapon kind of takes a minute to get used to. You start noticing how fast it swings, how much stamina it takes up, how far it actually reaches, and how many hits you can get in before you need to back off. That reach difference alone makes Abyss feel better than the first game. You're still fighting up close and you still have to respect the enemy, but I didn't feel like I had to stand an inch from something's face just to hit it. There's a little bit more breathing room now. The game still feels tense, but melee feels a lot more playable. You also notice the directional attacks pretty quickly once you start playing. You can swing left, swing right, attack overhead, or stab forward. And those attacks are tied to different damage types. Left and right swings are slash attacks, overhead attacks are break, and stabs are pierce. You can really feel that when you're actually playing. Some weapons clearly do better with a slash than a stab. Some attacks feel faster or more comfortable depending on the weapon. So once I had a weapon equipped, I would usually test it for a bit, figure out what felt good, and then settle into a little pattern. Maybe that just meant throwing out a couple of slashes and then backing off, or going for a stab if the weapon felt like it was made for it. Sometimes it was just avoiding certain attacks altogether because they felt too slow or didn't really do much damage with that weapon. That's the part that feels good though. The weapons start to feel like something you're actually getting used to, instead of just a stat going up in a menu. Magic is here too, but for me, it was more of an option than the center of combat. The game gives you ways to use it, and I did use it some, but my run was mostly just built around swords and guns. A big part of that came from gear. Sometimes I'd find a strong piece of equipment that had a seal effect, which blocked magic use, and a lot of the time, I still went with the stronger gear. Honestly, the yellow effect that Seal puts on the screen bothered me more than losing magic itself. So magic is part of the toolset, but it was never the main thing for me. And then sometimes my equipment choices just pushed it out of the picture. There's also body damage, and that's one of the cooler ideas in Abyss. You can shoot wings off flying enemies to make them drop to the ground. You can damage different parts of creatures. Sometimes something loses a leg and starts crawling. That sounds like it could technically be a big part of the combat system, but really, at least for me, it felt more like a cool outcome of fighting than the main thing every fight was built around. I wasn't going into every fight thinking, okay, I need to take out this limb first. It was more like I would just fight, shoot, swing, and then sometimes the enemy would change because of the damage. And honestly, that still counts. It gives the enemies more presence. It makes combat feel more physical. When a flying enemy drops or something starts crawling after taking damage, the fight feels more alive. But the real center of combat is still the tool choice. What do I have in my hands? How much ammo do I want to spend? How much stamina do I have? Is this weapon close to breaking? Can I finish this enemy safely, or do I need to switch? That's where Abyss works best. It gives you a huge arsenal that makes you deal with the cost of using it. The important thing is that Abyss feels better because it gives you more control, gives you a bit more range, more ways to react. It still has that old awkwardness, but now it has enough systems around it that learning how to fight actually feels rewarding. After the combat, the next thing Abyss really makes you deal with is weight. And I mean that pretty literally. The game gives you a ton of stuff to pick up. Weapons, armor, ammo, healing items, status cures, weird equipment, backup gear, and all kinds of things that make you stop and go, yeah, I might want that later. And for me, that's kind of dangerous because I have that collector's loot goblin kind of mindset. If the game puts something in front of me, I want to grab it, see what it does, test the weapon, compare the armor, and hold on to a few extra guns just in case I might use them later. Abyss feeds that part of my brain constantly. Then eventually, the game makes you feel what you're carrying. That's where the weight system starts to kick in. At first, I would just pick everything up and not pay any attention to the limit. Then I'd hit that first level of being over-encumbered, and my movement would slow down. That by itself is annoying, but it's manageable. Then if you keep pushing it, the effect gets worse, and it actually stacks in tiers instead of just being one flat penalty. And that same idea shows up across all the game's status effects. At the highest tier for over-encumbrance, you're barely moving. The game also starts damaging you for carrying too much, so there's a real danger there if you're low on healing. What stood out most to me was how it completely kills your momentum. You're dragging yourself through the tower because you brought too much with you. And the part that really makes it frustrating is that you can't just open your menu and throw things on the ground. You have to reach a shop/storage point to actually deal with it. So if you overload yourself in the middle of an area, that mistake follows you, sometimes for a while. That's one of the best things about the system, even when it annoyed me. The inventory is something physical. It affects how fast you move, how safely you can travel, how badly you need to find the next green crystal. And honestly, it felt fair. I picked everything up. I was the one carrying too much. The game was pretty clear about what happened when I crossed that line, so it felt fair, even when I was annoyed by it. Abyss knows that the player is going to want all this gear, and then it builds pressure around that desire. That's why the huge item pool becomes more than a reward system. Finding gear is exciting. The game constantly gives you something new to check, but every item also becomes a small decision. Do I keep this? Do I sell it? Do I store it? Is this worth the wait? Am I actually going to use this, or am I just carrying it because I don't want to let go of it? That's where the survival layer starts to shift away from only combat. A lot of the pressure comes from managing the aftermath of exploration. You survived the area, you found the weapons, you picked up the armor, you grabbed the resources. Now you have to clean up the mess you made in your inventory. Status effects add another layer to that. Abyss has a handful of conditions that can mess with you. There's poison, paralysis, darkness, curse, gravity, seal, and each of those can make the climb more irritating or more dangerous depending on when they hit you. For me, gravity and paralysis were the most annoying ones. Gravity slows you down, and that matters a lot in a game where movement already has a lot of weight behind it. It becomes especially frustrating when it hits in the middle of a fight, because suddenly you can't reposition the way you need to. If there are multiple enemies in the room, that slowdown can get you surrounded, and what should have been a manageable fight turns into a scramble just to stay alive. Paralysis is even worse in the moment because it stops you from moving and attacking. If you have the item to cure it, you can deal with it, but if you don't, you're just stuck there until it wears off. Luckily, I didn't feel like it lasted nearly as long as paralysis did in the first game, so it was easier to deal with here, but it still gives the game this nasty little way of interrupting your flow. The good thing is that status cures felt pretty manageable most of the time. Enemies dropped different cure items often enough that I usually had something on me. There were a couple of moments where I didn't have what I needed, and those moments stood out because the game suddenly slowed down around that condition. But most of the time, status effects felt like another thing to keep stocked rather than something that completely took over the game. And that's kind of the pattern with Abyss's survival system. The game pressures you, then gives you ways to manage that pressure if you're paying attention. And that's where the shops become really important. Abyss uses these crystal-like shop points, and the main ones are really easy to remember. The green crystals are merchants, purple crystals are blacksmiths, red crystals are healers, and cyan crystals are save points. For me, the green and purple crystals were the ones that mattered the most. The red healer crystals is a cool addition to the Shadow Tower system because you can sacrifice gear to heal yourself. I tested it once to see how it worked, and I like the idea. It fits this series really well, because turning your equipment into health feels exactly like that kind of strange trade Abyss would make you consider. For me though, I barely used it. I usually had better ways to heal, and I didn't feel like sacrificing gear was necessary most of the time. So the red crystal's worth talking about because it adds another harsh little option to the economy. But it wasn't the main thing carrying me through the game. The green shop was different. That was a big one. The green shop is where the whole collector problem finally gets sorted out. This is what I wanted to find. I could sell gear, buy items, buy ammo, pick up healing supplies, and use storage. Early on, storage was basically a dumping ground for me. I would have too many guns, a big collection of random armor, just too many things I didn't want to sell yet. So I would throw stuff into storage because I wanted the weight off me without losing the item forever. Later in the game, the storage became a bit more intentional. Once I started finding stronger equipment and armor sets I actually cared about, I used storage more like a real stash. There were pieces I didn't want to sell because they were strong, rare, or had some useful effect. So the green shop starts feeling like a place where I could protect that gear I might want later. Selling was usually pretty straightforward. A lot of the time, I would just go through each gear menu and clean house. If I had a bunch of armor I was never going to use, I sold it. If I had magic-focused gear and I was barely using magic, I sold it. If something was clearly weaker and had no special effect at all, it was probably gone. The exceptions were the interesting pieces. If gear had passive health regen, I was going to keep that, even if I wasn't going to use it at that exact second. I knew the value was there. Anything with a strong passive effect or some weird utility made me hesitate more than basic stats did. So the green shop becomes this little reset point where I had to decide how I actually wanted to play. For me, that meant weapons, guns, health items, ammo, and a few pieces of gear that felt too useful or just too cool to throw away. Cunes also feel different in Abyss than they did in the first game. In the first Shadow Tower, cunes felt more like a special currency. You saved them up and they were tied more closely to specific gear or special purchases. In Abyss, they feel more like normal money. You find them more often, you can sell items to get more, and you can use them to buy regular supplies, armor, weapons, health items, ammo, whatever you need from the green shop. That changes the flow a lot. Cunes becomes part of how you keep the climb moving. You explore, pick up gear, sell what you don't need, turn that into healing or ammo, then head back out. And depending on how you're playing, that shop support can become pretty important. There were definitely times where I was low on ammo or didn't have healing items, so buying resources from the green shop felt necessary at points, especially because I was using guns pretty often and also using healing items to support repairs. And that brings us to the purple shop. The purple crystal is where you repair gear, and this is where Abyss keeps one of the strongest Shadow Tower ideas alive. Repairing costs health. That sounds pretty brutal the first time you hear it, and it still has that harsh feeling to it. You're using your own life to keep your equipment together. But really, that just becomes part of how you play the game. You get to a repair shop, burn through your health fixing your gear, then you use a healing item to refill your health. Since healing potions restore your full health bar, no matter how high your max health is, they become really useful for that repair loop. So I would repair until my health was low, use a potion, then keep repairing if I had more potions and more gear worth fixing. That's the basic upkeep in Abyss. It's still kind of nasty as a concept. Your body is basically the repair currency. But once you understand the loop, the purple shop becomes one of the main places where you reset yourself for the next stretch of the tower. And that's really what all this comes down to. Abyss is a game about management.
That would be funny to set it up like a Raid Shadow Legends. You're like, and today's sponsor, Raid! And then just stop there. Like, no Shadow, like everybody expects Shadow Legends, but it's just Raid, and then I'll hold up just a can of spray.
The combat gives you a lot of tools, and the exploration gives you a lot to pick up. Then the rest of the game asks you to keep all that under control. Weight decides how much you can carry, status effects can slow you down or interrupt your movement, Cues keep the economy moving, green shops let you sell, store, buy, and unload. The purple shop lets you keep your equipment alive, and every trip back to the shop becomes this little moment where you sort yourself out before continuing the climb. That's why the survival side of Abyss really works for me. It's not always terrifying. Most of the time, it's just you doing the usual routine. Checking your gear, cleaning out your inventory, grabbing what you need, fixing your weapons, and figuring out what's actually worth bringing with you to the next area. But that practicality is the point. Abyss makes survival feel like maintenance. You're constantly taking care of your body, the bag, the weapons, and the resources that keep the climb going. And if you ignore that too long, the tower makes you feel it. So now that we've talked about how Abyss is structured and how it actually plays, I think the story is fairly straightforward on the surface. This is one of those Fromsoftware plots where the setup is clear enough, but the deeper details are scattered around the world. The game gives you a reason to go in, to keep climbing, and then it lets the tower carry most of the weight from there. The basic story starts with an old legend. There was once a kingdom that rose to power through an arcane spear. This spear was tied to a long-dead ruler, and the story around it says that it helped bring the kingdom into an age of prosperity. By the time Abyss begins, the kingdom is gone. Most of what's left is covered in forests now. The old land's basically been swallowed up by time, and the tower is still there, just looming over the ruins like the last piece of something people don't really understand anymore. That's what pulls people back to the area. A large ruin is discovered in the forest, and an investigation team is organized to study it. The protagonist is part of the security attached to that expedition. He has a military background, and he's there as protection while the team looks into the site. That gives Abyss a bit of a different setup from the first game. We're starting from an expedition. There's already this feeling that people are walking into a place they should probably leave alone. It's ancient, sacred, and connected to a group of people who were already pushed out or destroyed by the conflict surrounding that region. This is where the old man comes in. The old man is one of the local guides, but the other guides treat him like an outsider. He seems tied to the people who once lived around the ruins, and he understands the place in a way the expedition doesn't. He tells the protagonist that the ruins are sacred to his people, and because the tribe has been scattered and can no longer protect the site, the old man has attached himself to the investigation. After the protagonist starts talking with him, the old man asks for help grabbing a treasure from inside the ruins. It's set up in a way that makes the protagonist feel bad for him. He's this old guy tied to lost people, a sacred place, and something he says needs to be brought back. So the protagonist follows him. They go to a shrine near the ruins, and once the protagonist steps inside, giant tree roots close over the entrance. At that point, the trap's set. The old man seals him inside and basically turns him into an offering. That's basically the moment everything really kicks off in Abyss. From there, the story becomes simple in the way old FromSoftware stories often are simple. We're trapped inside, the way out is above us, so we climb. That's why the tower structure works so well for the story. The plot gives the climb a reason. And then the rest of the game makes us feel what the climb actually costs. Every floor becomes another layer of that escape attempt. We move through these different worlds inside the tower, find the elevator keys, solve the little problems inside each area, and keep pushing higher. The main plot is about escape, but the experience around that escaping is kind of the point of it all. As we climb, Abyss also starts pulling in familiar pieces from the first Shadow Tower. The biggest one is Rurifin. I'm not going to turn this into some huge continuity deep dive because Abyss doesn't really need that to work, but her showing up again still matters because it's a reminder that this is all tied back to the same weird tower mythology from the first game. Rurifin was already one of the more memorable characters in the tower, and seeing her again makes Abyss feel like we're still stuck in that same bigger nightmare, even if everything around it feels a little different now. This is where Abyss starts feeling very old FromSoftware again. The game gives you images, encounters, fragments, then lets you sit with them. It keeps the explanation light, so the player is left trying to make sense of how the old man, the spear, Rurifin, the tower, and the final creature all fit together. The ending itself is very brief. After pushing through the final area, we reach what feels like the heart of the tower. You destroy it, and then the game cuts to the outside of the tower. The tower's hold is broken, the climb's over. Then we see a woman just watching from behind a tree, which most people think is Ruufin without her horns. That's basically where Abyss leaves us. It doesn't really stop to explain the spear in detail, and it definitely doesn't walk you through every part of the old man's ritual. Instead, it just gives you the escape, that last image, and this weird feeling that you made it out of something ancient without ever fully getting it. And that can feel pretty abrupt, but honestly, it also fits the kind of game Abyss is. The story starts with a legend about power, a lost kingdom, and a sacred ruin. Then it becomes about a man getting sealed into that ruin and forced to climb it. Along the way, the old mythology starts pressing back in through the tower, through Ruufin, through the final heart of the tower, and through the way the world seems to operate by rules nobody fully explains. Abyss has lore, and there are definitely pieces you can dig into, but the main plot is mostly there to give shape to the climb. The deeper story is the act of surviving that climb and slowly realizing that every floor is another part of the trap the old man pushed you into. That's why the story works better after talking about the mechanics, because once you understand the structure, the weapons, the shops, and the weight system, the plot starts to feel more connected to the actual experience. The old man traps you. The tower makes you prove you can survive it, and every floor above you becomes another step towards getting back out.
Give me your money. Oh god.
So after all that, the last thing to talk about is how Abyss actually landed. Because this is where the game's reputation kinda gets weird. Abyss came out in Japan as a PS2 sequel to Shadow Tower, and from what I could find, the reception there seemed pretty solid for what the game was. Famitsu gave it a 30 out of 40, which is a respectable score, especially for something this niche. Game Watch also covered it around launch, and their reviews give a pretty good picture of how Abyss was being seen at the time. They treated it as a proper follow-up to Shadow Tower, and pointed out how much had changed from the original. The controls were smoother, the movement was faster, combat had more speed behind it, and the game kept the dark atmosphere that made the first one stand out. So in Japan, Abyss seemed to land as a stronger and more playable version of that Shadow Tower idea. The interesting part is that Game Watch also felt the game was easier than the first Shadow Tower. And I really agree with that. Abyss was easier to understand, it had better controls, more useful weapons, clearer progression, and a structure that was easier to settle into. For some people, that probably made it a better game. For people who wanted the same rough edge as the original, that probably made it feel a bit softer. That's an important distinction for how the game landed. Abyss was respected as an improvement, while also carrying the risk of being too approachable for people who loved how harsh the first game was. Then we have the sales side. During its release week in Japan, Abyss landed at 14th place and sold right under 13,000 copies. It kind of tells you everything you need to know. It showed up on the charts, but it wasn't exactly making waves. It was also a pretty niche release. That matters here because the Western version was already in motion. Age Tech was working on an English localization. That part's important because Age Tech had already been tied to Fromsoftware's older Western releases, so Abyss had a real path to reaching the audience that knew Kingsfield and Shadow Tower. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, Age Tech producer Mark Johnson said the localization was almost finished, aside from the packaging and the manual. That's the part that makes Abyss feel different from a game that simply stayed in Japan. The English release was close, it was almost done. Then Sony canceled it before release. The usual reasons people point to are projected sales and worries about how the game stacked up visually against other RPGs and first-person games at the time. And if you think about what the market looked like around 2003, 2004, it's pretty easy to see why a publisher might have been nervous about that. The PS2 library was crowded. RPGs were becoming bigger and flashier and easier to sell from just screenshots and trailers. First-person games were also moving in a different direction visually. Abyss was dark, weird, slow, and very specific. It came from a series with a small Western audience and didn't have the kind of presentation that immediately explained its appeal on a store shelf, so SCEA passed on it. There was a petition from fans, and Mark Johnson reportedly fought for the release, calling the cancellation one of the hardest things for him to accept, but the release just never happened. Age Tech would go on to publish Echo Night Beyond in the US instead, which is interesting because that game also came from FromSoftware's strange PS2 era. Abyss stayed behind, and that decision shaped the entire legacy of the game. Because in the West, Abyss didn't follow the typical release path. It didn't receive an official launch, widespread reviews, or the kind of word of mouth that helps the game build an audience at the time. Instead, it became one of those games people heard about in pieces, a sequel to Shadow Tower, a Japanese-only FromSoftware game, the one with guns. That became the reputation for years, and I think that's why Abyss feels so hidden now. Its obscurity was not only about the game being strange, a lot of strange games still find their people if they actually make it to them. Abyss had its path cut off before that could happen in the West. Then the fan translation changed things, which is what we saw here today. Once English-speaking players had a way to actually play it, Abyss finally started reaching the audience that had been curious about it for years. Import players, FromSoftware fans, Kingsfield fans, Shadow Tower fans, and eventually Souls fans all had a reason to look back at it. That later timing matters a lot. By the time a lot of Western players discovered Abyss, From Software's reputation had changed completely. Demon Souls happened, Dark Souls happened. Eventually, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring would push that reputation even further, so people started looking backward. And once that happened, these older FromSoft games started being read differently. King's Field, Shadow Tower, Eternal Ring, Echo Knight, Kuon, and Abyss all became part of a bigger conversation about where From Software's design language came from. That's where Abyss found its second life. People were no longer looking at it as some random Japanese-only dungeon RPG. They were looking at it as a lost branch from the studio that would later become famous for these dangerous worlds, cryptic storytelling, weird NPCs, hard-earned progress, and systems that expect the player to pay attention. That gave Abyss a new kind of value. It became a game people looked at with hindsight. And with hindsight, its place in From Software's history is a lot easier to understand. Abyss sits near the end of that old-school first-person RPG branch. This was the last one From Software made. And that makes it feel more important now than it probably did at launch. Because after this, From Software moved on. The studio didn't keep making Shadow Tower games. It didn't keep building first-person dungeon RPGs in this exact way. A few years later, Demon Souls would take some of those old ideas and push them into a new form. That makes Abyss feel like a closing point. It's one of the last times From Software made this kind of game in this kind of body. And because the Western release vanished, most people missed that closing point when it happened. That's the legacy of Abyss. It missed its moment in the West, then gained meaning later because people went back looking for the paths From Software left behind. And Shadow Tower Abyss is one of those paths. A weird PS2 sequel that landed respectably in Japan, disappeared before reaching a Western audience officially, and eventually became one of From Software's most memorable hidden gems.
He is dead, then. Will you seek the spear next? No, fine. Don't give me no more words. Whatever.
And that's Shadow Tower Abyss. I really appreciate y'all hanging out with me for a bit and going through this game with me. If you liked the video, be sure to subscribe. There's already a lot of content like this on the channel, and there is always more coming. And if you want to help the video grow, leaving a like and dropping a comment really does help a lot. Let me know if you ever had a chance to play Abyss, or if seeing this video made you interested in checking it out. I also have a video on the first Shadow Tower that should be showing up on screen or over on the side. If you haven't seen that one yet, I definitely recommend giving it a look too, because the game's really interesting in its own ways. Also want to give a massive shout out to all the channel members and to everyone who supported the streams for this game with super chats. I really do appreciate you all. I also used some of that stream footage in this video, and that's not something I usually do, so let me know how you like that. I thought it was a cool way to bring some of that playthrough into the final video, and making this one feel a little bit more connected to the people who were there while I was going through it. And you also get to attach a face to the voice. But again, thank you all so much for the support. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see y'all later.
No. Tried to sneak me again.